The Sinaloa Cartel has been running the global drug trade for over 3 decades. Everyone knows El Chapo. His face has been on every news channel, every documentary, every Netflix series. But what if I told you that El Chapo was never actually the most powerful man in the Sinaloa Cartel? What if I told you there was someone else, someone smarter, someone quieter, someone who operated in the shadows for over 50 years and never once set foot in a prison cell until 2024? Meet Ismael Mario Zambada Garcia, alias El Mayo. He was the true power behind the Sinaloa Cartel, the co-founder who let El Chapo take all the spotlight while he quietly built the most sophisticated drug trafficking network the world has ever seen. He was on the DEA's most wanted list for decades. He had a $15 million bounty on his head. He was responsible for moving hundreds of tons of cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl into the United States. And for over 50 years, nobody could catch him. Not the DEA, not the FBI, not the Mexican military, not anyone. Until July 25, 2024, when everything changed in the most shocking way imaginable. Today we dive deep into the incredible story of El Mayo Zambada, the invisible drug lord who controlled an empire worth billions, the man who was betrayed by the son of his own partner, and the secret arrest that sent shockwaves through the entire criminal underworld. This is a story of power, loyalty, betrayal, and the ultimate downfall of a man who thought he was untouchable. And trust me, you've never heard anything like it. Ismael Mario Zambada Garcia was born on January 1, 1948, in the small town of El Alamo in Culiacan, Sinaloa, Mexico. Sinaloa is the birthplace of Mexican drug trafficking. The mountains there have been used to grow opium poppies and marijuana since the early 20th century, long before the word cartel ever entered the public vocabulary. The region was poor, isolated, and ignored by the Mexican government. For generations, farming drugs was simply how people survived. El Mayo grew up in this world. His family was humble. They worked the land. They lived in a small house with dirt floors. There was no running water, no electricity, no opportunities. Education was a luxury most families in El Alamo couldn't afford. Mayo dropped out of school at a young age and started working in the fields. But these weren't ordinary fields. They were poppy fields. From the time he was a teenager, Mayo was involved in the cultivation of opium poppies. He learned how to grow them, how to harvest the raw opium, how to process it, and how to sell it to the traffickers who moved it north toward the United States border. He was a natural. He was patient, methodical, and incredibly careful. While other young men in Sinaloa were loud and reckless, drawing attention to themselves with guns and flashy behavior, Mayo was quiet. He observed. He learned. He built relationships slowly and carefully. He earned people's trust. And he never, ever drew unnecessary attention to himself. By his early 20s, Mayo had moved beyond simple poppy farming. He was now organizing his own small trafficking operations, moving marijuana and heroin across the border into the United States. He built a network of trusted associates, many of them family members and childhood friends from El Alamo. Loyalty was everything to Mayo. He didn't trust outsiders. He didn't trust people who talked too much. He surrounded himself with people who had known him their entire lives, people who would die before they betrayed him. In the 1970s and 1980s, the Mexican drug trade was dominated by the Guadalajara Cartel, led by figures like Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, Rafael Caro Quintero, and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo. Mayo worked within this system, building his operations under the umbrella of the larger organization. But he was always independent. He never fully submitted to anyone else's authority. He was building his own thing, quietly, patiently, brick by brick. When the Guadalajara cartel collapsed in the late 1980s following the murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena and the subsequent crackdown by the Mexican and American governments, the drug trade fractured into smaller regional organizations. This was Mayo's moment. He allied himself with Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, a young, ambitious trafficker from the mountains of Badiraguado who was quickly making a name for himself. Together, they co-founded what would become the Sinaloa Cartel, the most powerful drug trafficking organization in history. But here's what most people don't understand about the relationship between Mayo and El Chapo. They were partners, but they were very different kinds of leaders. El Chapo was the face of the cartel. He was bold, charismatic, and dramatic. He built tunnels under the U.S. border. He escaped from maximum security prisons. He gave interviews to Sean Penn and Kate Del Castillo. He loved the attention. He loved being known as the world's most powerful drug lord. Mayo was the opposite. He was the shadow behind the throne. He avoided cameras, avoided public appearances, avoided anything that might put his face in front of law enforcement. In over 50 years of drug trafficking, there were only a handful of known photographs of El Mayo. He gave exactly one interview in his entire career to the Mexican journalist Julio Garcia in 2010. In that interview, he said something that revealed everything about his philosophy. He said he would rather die than go to prison. He said he had been running and hiding his entire life. He said he knew that one day it would all end, but until that day, he would keep going. That interview was remarkable because it showed a man who had no illusions about his life. He wasn't glorifying the narco lifestyle. He wasn't pretending to be a hero. He was simply stating facts. He was a drug trafficker. He had been one his entire life, and he would continue to be one until he was dead or captured. While El Chapo grabbed headlines, Mayo was running the actual business. He managed the cartel's relationships with Colombian cocaine suppliers. He oversaw the transportation routes that moved drugs from South America through Central America and Mexico into the United States. He managed the money laundering operations that cleaned billions of dollars in drug proceeds. He maintained relationships with corrupt Mexican politicians, military officers, and law enforcement officials at every level of government. Mayo's corruption network was legendary. He didn't just bribe individual cops or politicians. He built entire systems of corruption that ensured the cartel's operations could continue regardless of which political party was in power. Governors, senators, generals, federal police commanders, Mayo had relationships with all of them. He knew that in Mexico, power changes hands regularly, so he invested in relationships across the political spectrum. This is why he was never caught. While El Chapo was eventually betrayed by people in his inner circle, while other drug lords were hunted down through electronic surveillance and intelligence operations, Mayo remained untouchable. His corruption network warned him of any operations planned against him. His discipline meant he never made the mistakes that brought down other traffickers. He didn't use phones. He didn't send emails. He didn't use social media. He communicated through trusted messengers. He moved between safe houses in the mountains of Sinaloa and Durango, never staying in one place too long. He was a ghost. Under Mayo's management, the Sinaloa Cartel became the dominant drug trafficking organization in Mexico and arguably the world. At its peak, the cartel controlled an estimated 60% of the drug trade between Mexico and the United States. They were moving cocaine by the ton, heroin by the 100 kilos, methamphetamine by the truckload, and eventually fentanyl by the millions of doses. The revenue was staggering. Estimates suggest the Sinaloa Cartel generated between $5 and $10 billion annually. That's more than the GDP of many countries. And Mayo was at the center of it all, managing the finances, maintaining the alliances, resolving disputes, and ensuring that the money kept flowing. But Mayo's role went beyond just business management. He was also the cartel's diplomat. In the narco world, conflicts between trafficking organizations can erupt into devastating wars that draw law enforcement attention and disrupt business. Mayo was the one who negotiated truces, who mediated disputes, who maintained the fragile alliances that kept the cartel functioning. When El Chapo was arrested in 2014 and then again in 2016 before being extradited to the United States in 2017, Mayo kept the cartel running. There was no power vacuum, no collapse, no chaos. The transition was seamless because Mayo had always been the real operational leader. El Chapo's arrest didn't change anything fundamental about how the Sinaloa Cartel operated. And that's the ultimate testament to Mayo's genius. He built an organization that didn't depend on any single personality. It depended on systems, on relationships, on corruption networks, on supply chains. It was a machine, and Mayo was the engineer who kept it running. Now let me tell you about Mayo's family, because family is central to understanding how the Sinaloa Cartel operates. Mayo didn't just build a criminal organization. He built a criminal dynasty. His sons were deeply involved in cartel operations. Vicente Zambada Niebla, known as Vicentillo, was one of his most trusted lieutenants. Vicentillo managed key aspects of the cartel's cocaine trafficking operations and served as a liaison with Colombian suppliers. But in 2009, Vicentillo was arrested in Mexico and eventually extradited to the United States. What happened next shocked the narco world. Vicentillo became a cooperating witness for the U.S. government. He testified against El Chapo at his trial in New York in 2019, providing detailed testimony about the cartel's operations, its corruption network, and its leadership structure. He revealed that the cartel had paid hundreds of millions of dollars in bribes to Mexican officials. He described how drugs were moved, how money was laundered, how rivals were eliminated. His testimony was devastating. For Mayo, his son's cooperation with the American government was a deep personal betrayal. But it was also a strategic disaster. Vicentillo knew everything about the cartel's operations. He knew the routes, the contacts, the safe houses, the corruption networks. His testimony gave the DEA an unprecedented look inside the Sinaloa Cartel. Mayo had to adapt. He changed routes, changed contacts, changed methods. He rebuilt what his son's testimony had compromised. And he kept going. Because that's what Mayo did. He survived. He adapted. He endured. Mayo's other sons also played roles in the cartel. Ismael Zambada Imperial, known as Mayo Gordo, was involved in methamphetamine trafficking before his arrest in 2014. Another son, Serafin Zambada Ortiz, was arrested in 2013. Mayo watched his sons get arrested and extradited one by one, but he himself remained free. It was as if the universe was taking everything from him except his freedom. And then came July 25th, 2024, the day everything ended. Here's what happened, and I want you to pay close attention because this is one of the most extraordinary events in the history of the drug war. On that day, a small private plane landed at an airstrip near El Paso, Texas. On board were two passengers. One was Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the most wanted drug lord in the Western Hemisphere. The other was Joaquin Guzman Lopez, one of El Chapo's sons and a leader of Los Chapitos. Both men were immediately taken into custody by American federal agents. The arrest stunned the world. After more than 50 years of evading capture, El Mayo was finally in handcuffs. But the circumstances of his arrest were unlike anything anyone had ever seen. According to Mayo's lawyers, he didn't surrender voluntarily. He was tricked. They claimed that Joaquin Guzman Lopez, the son of his former partner El Chapo, lured Mayo to a meeting under false pretenses. Mayo believed he was going to meet with Guzman Lopez to discuss cartel business. Instead, he was taken to an airstrip where a plane was waiting. He was forced onto the plane, and the plane flew directly to the United States, where federal agents were waiting to arrest him. If this account is true, and there is significant evidence to support it, then Mayo was betrayed by the family of his own partner. The Guzman family, the family he had worked with for decades, the family he had protected, the family whose sons he had helped raise in the cartel business, turned on him. Why? The answer lies in the internal war that has been tearing the Sinaloa Cartel apart since El Chapo's extradition. After El Chapo was sent to the United States, the cartel split into two main factions. One faction was led by Los Chapitos, El Chapo's sons, including Ivan Archivaldo, Ovidio, Jesus Alfredo, and Joaquin. The other faction was led by Mayo. For years, the two factions coexisted uneasily. But tensions were building. Los Chapitos were younger, more aggressive, and more reckless. They embraced fentanyl trafficking, which brought enormous profits, but also enormous heat from the U.S. government. They were flashy and violent, drawing exactly the kind of attention that Mayo had spent his entire career avoiding. Mayo reportedly disapproved of Los Chapitos' methods. He thought they were too reckless, too violent, too willing to draw attention. He preferred the old way of doing things, quietly, efficiently, without unnecessary bloodshed. The two factions started competing for territory, for routes, for suppliers. Conflicts erupted. People died. The Sinaloa Cartel, once the most unified and disciplined criminal organization in Mexico, was tearing itself apart. And then Joaquin Guzman Lopez made his move. By delivering Mayo to the Americans, he accomplished several things simultaneously. He eliminated the leader of the rival faction. He earned goodwill with the U.S. government, potentially securing a favorable deal for himself and his family. And he reshaped the power dynamics within the Sinaloa Cartel, in Los Chapitos' favor. For Mayo, it was the ultimate betrayal. The man who had spent 50 years trusting no one, who had built his empire on loyalty and caution, was undone by the one thing he never saw coming: betrayal from within his own cartel family. After his arrest, Mayo was taken to El Paso, Texas, where he made his initial court appearance. He looked old, tired, and frail. The most powerful drug lord in the world, the man who had evaded capture for half a century, stood before an American judge in handcuffs, charged with conspiracy to manufacture and distribute fentanyl, heroin, methamphetamine, cocaine, and marijuana. He faced additional charges of money laundering and weapons offenses. If convicted on all counts, he faces life in prison. His lawyers have argued that he was kidnapped and brought to the United States against his will, which could raise significant legal issues. But regardless of how he got there, the fact remains that El Mayo is now in American custody, and he is unlikely to ever see freedom again. The aftermath of Mayo's arrest has been catastrophic for the Sinaloa Cartel and for Mexico. In Sinaloa, the arrest triggered an immediate wave of violence as the two factions went to war openly. Gun battles erupted in Culiacan and other cities. Roadblocks were set up. Businesses were burned. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. The Mexican government deployed thousands of troops to restore order, but the violence continued for weeks. The cartel's operations were disrupted but not destroyed. Drug trafficking continued, because the demand in the United States didn't stop just because one man was arrested. Other leaders stepped up to fill the void. New alliances were formed. New conflicts erupted. The cycle of violence and trafficking continued, as it always does. But Mayo's arrest marked the end of an era. He was the last of the old guard, the last of the original founders of the Sinaloa Cartel. With him gone, the organization is now fully in the hands of a younger generation, Los Chapitos and their allies. Whether they can maintain the discipline and sophistication that Mayo brought to the operation remains to be seen. So what does the story of El Mayo Zambada tell us? It tells us that even the most careful, most disciplined, most intelligent criminal can eventually be brought down. Mayo did everything right by narco standards. He avoided the spotlight. He maintained operational security. He built corruption networks that protected him for decades. He adapted to changing circumstances. He survived while everyone around him was arrested or killed. And in the end, none of it mattered. He was undone not by brilliant law enforcement work, not by advanced technology, not by surveillance or informants. He was undone by betrayal, the most human of all weaknesses. It tells us that the drug war creates its own cycles of destruction. Mayo rose because the Guadalajara cartel fell. The Sinaloa cartel grew because rivals were eliminated. Mayo fell because the internal dynamics of his own organization turned against him. And whoever replaces him will eventually fall too, because that's how this world works. Nobody wins forever. It tells us that the cost of the drug trade is measured not just in money and power, but in human suffering on an unimaginable scale. The drugs that Mayo moved into the United States killed hundreds of thousands of people. The violence his organization perpetrated in Mexico destroyed communities, displaced families, and traumatized generations. The corruption he fostered undermined Mexican democracy and the rule of law. His legacy is not one of genius or power. It is one of devastation. It tells us that the relationship between the United States and Mexico is defined by the drug trade in ways that most people don't fully understand. American demand for drugs fuels Mexican supply. American money funds Mexican cartels. American weapons arm Mexican sicarios. And American law enforcement drives the violence by creating the prohibition that makes the drug trade so profitable. Mayo understood this better than anyone. He knew that as long as Americans wanted drugs, someone in Mexico would supply them. And he made sure that someone was him. Finally, it tells us that loyalty, the thing Mayo valued above all else, is the most fragile currency in the criminal world. Mayo trusted the Guzman family. He worked with them for decades. He helped build their empire. He protected their interests. And in the end, they handed him over to the Americans. In the narco world, there is no loyalty. There is only self-interest. And when self-interest demands betrayal, betrayal comes without hesitation. Ismael El Mayo Zambada Garcia is now 77 years old. He sits in an American federal detention facility, awaiting trial on charges that could send him to prison for the rest of his life. The empire he spent 50 years building is fracturing. His sons are in American custody. His partner's sons betrayed him. His legacy is being written in blood and fentanyl. He once told a journalist that he would rather die than go to prison. Now he's living the fate he feared most. The invisible drug lord, the Shadow King, the man who ran the world's most powerful cartel from the mountains of Sinaloa for half a century, is finally visible. And the world can see exactly what he is. Not a folk hero, not a genius, not a legend, just an old man in handcuffs, facing the consequences of a life built on poison and death. Subscribe for more untold stories of power and crime. Real stories told unfiltered, because the truth behind the headlines is always more shocking than the headlines themselves. See you soon.